Okay, good morning. We're in Hemshech Tzadik Daled, 5694, page 81. Okay, good. Page 81. So, summarizing, we've been talking about the process, the creative process from creator to creation, from producer to product. Two levels of Ayin Be'emtza, the channel in between, which breaks into two, one that relates more to the creator and one that relates more to existence. In that emerges desire for existence, which means a relationship, the beginnings of a relationship. And initially, he spoke about two levels: level of desire that's called either power of desire or hidden desire or machshava, which is a determination. So there's a state before that was that determination, a state when it was all not conscious and not aware, and there was no gilui altogether. This at least is an inspiration. Now I want, it's worthy to want. Roy Litzes, that's the exact words he used. And now it's worthy to want, which comes, we'll soon speak about how that breaks down further. Then comes level two, a Ratzon Goli, an actual Ratzon Sinner, a channel that actually is being drawn to and pursuing the desired objective. And that includes Hashara B'Kayach, where you envision and allocate and estimate basically resources, so you have to get into details. It's not just a general desire that you want it, that it's worthy of wanting and there's nothing else happening besides that. It's now actual pursuit. Now, in this mimer, chapter 18, page 80 and 81, he said that till now we've been speaking about two levels. That's in general. When you break it down, it's three levels. And he calls them one. The first one is Ratzon HaKlali, a general desire. The second level is Ratzon HaPrati, a specific desire. And Ratzon HaKodum, which is can everybody just mute? Okay. So, and the third is called Ratzon HaKodum. What does Kodum mean? It precedes the actual revealed desire, which is going to activate the whole implementation. So now we're in the middle of discussing these three levels. And as we're discussing them, the Frierdiker Rebbe further dissects it and breaks it down into more levels. And I'll spell them out. And as I said, we haven't finished the subject, so it's going to be a little more reading before we go back and really try to wrap our heads around all the different levels. But here's what we figured out so far. What I'm reviewing now is the bottom of page 80 through the middle of page 81, where we stopped. Okay. So here's a key line that he's been now explaining at length. He says that this, let me just see. Okay. So to explain the Ratzon HaKlali, he says the Heskem that we've been talking about, which until now we read it as Heskem v'Hechlet. If you remember, back in the previous mimer, I'm just going back to the pages. The word Heskem and Hechlet was used synonymously. It was used in one sentence, in one phrase. I just want to see it inside for a moment. Yeah, on page 53. So he says the following words. Heskem b'lvad sheroy lirtzis. She says, "Asher heskem v'hechlet bo b'rotzim muchlet." So there, when we read it, it didn't seem that he was distinguishing. Now, when you go back there, you see that they are different, but he didn't explain it. So there, we were talking about a determination. Now he breaks down, how does one become determined? Like if you, let's go back to the example, you want a home. It's one of the inherent and one of the integral desires of the human being. Ein Adam b'loy bayis, we've talked about. Adam b'loy bayis ein Adam. A person wants a home. So this desire, as we spoke about, could be dormant within your nefesh, within the spirit of the human being for years, and you shouldn't even be aware of it. Children are not aware of necessarily an active desire to want a home. Then comes the point that something gets stimulated. We're not getting now how that happens, whether it's because you get older, you start thinking about it, you see other people with a home, or you just realize that this is something that is necessary for a human being. Whatever the reason is, something happened. I'm talking, of course, in the mashal. With God, we always know that God chose it to be this way. But once he chose it, this is the Seder. So now, at some point in life, there's a stimulation. But till now, we've been learning, okay, and you come to that determination, but we didn't yet pursue the desire. You're not drawn to it yet. In other words, you can make the decision, I want a home, and it could take another 10 years. So it took 20, 30 years till you just made that determination, another 20 years until you actively go pursue it and be drawn to it. That was what we learned. But now, when you put it under the microscope, and magnify this level of stimulation and inspiration, that will lead to a determination that is not yet actively pursuing. The Frierdiker Rebbe says, if you could look into it, you'll see there's more levels. Because first, the desire arises in your mind. This is like an agree. We call it the word to agree. To agree, it's now agreeable to me, this concept, this desire. I want to now explore it. As he said, as we read the other day, and I'm reading it now, I'm just reading the point she said. She said, this Heskim, even though, I'm reading from the bottom of page 80, just a summary. Even though it's a Yerida from the Atzmus HaNefesh. Why? Because Atzmus HaNefesh didn't even have this beginning of, it wasn't even a stirring. Nothing even stirred. To use the example with a human being, it could be years before you even begin to think about the idea of having a home. Or the artist, it could be years before he even thinks that he wants to create art. Or consider. I think another word for Heskin could be consideration, not just agreement, to consider. She says, although it's a Yerida from Atzmus, because Atzmus, it doesn't even relate altogether to anything. Here you're beginning to consider the prospect of relating. That's the Heskim. But at the same time, this does not mean the Heskim did become a Metzias Dover Adayin. It didn't yet materialize into something. It's a consideration. It's a consideration. So Lo Nasa Metzias Dover Adayin. And he now goes on to explain the next quarter of a page at least, or even more, probably a quarter of a page. What does this mean? Doesn't become Metzias Dover. And that's where he breaks it down into further levels. Because if it was an active determination, which is the end of the process of the Ratzon Klali, then it's still not a Metzias Dover in the sense that you could say you're actually pursuing it. It's still only in the determination level. But it at least come to an absolute determination. Now it's a consideration. So this is what he says. So it didn't come into Metzias Dover, but Sir Mefurid b'Mechus Metziyusei. In a specific detailed structure, or any type of shape and form, the Mehus Mitziyusei. Remember, Mehus Mitziyusei is the next level where you're actually dealing with the details. And he said this is only the mitzias of the muhus. In other words, but the muhus I described would be before you even have this stirring. Now the consideration is the mitzias of the muhus. Something has emerged from the muhus of the muhus that is considering relating to another. So now he said, even though we say it's already after this, something has been stimulated, something has been inspired. That a thing like this is worthy to desire. So he says, now he goes back, this is called machshava. This is called thought. And even Ratzon Anelam, he says, which seems to be a lower level, is called a cool thought, a machshava kara, a cold thought. And for sure the heskim, which means you only began considering lo yachol alav gam hanochas shem machshava kara. You can't even call it a cool thought or a cold thought, detached thought, ki'im shem machshava, just thought. What is it coming to negate? She says it's not coming to date that it's not an actual desire yet. Ein ratzon adai. It's not a desire. Because the stimulation or the inspiration that brought this consideration or agreement, if you wish, is only that it's worthy to desire, but not that actually desiring. In other words, what's arisen in this person's mind, if you're talking about a person, what's arisen not in the mind, what's arisen in the person's spirit, is here's a consideration that something is worthy to be desired. In this case, would be a home in the example we're using. So therefore, he says the heskim, therefore, is only the beginning. I'm not reading every word. I'm just going over this piece so we have as clear as possible before we move on. So it's only the beginning of a ratzon klali. So we're talking about the first stage of ratzon, the first early stirrings, the early beginnings, is that there is the beginning of a ratzon klali. Afterwards will come the hachlata. The hachlata is already not the beginning where you're considering it, where you've considered it, deliberated on it, and came to a full determination. Yes, absolutely. This is what is worthy to be desired. What it didn't do, it didn't begin to pursue or drawn to the thing you're desiring. So we have here now 3 levels in the ratzon klali. The beginning stirring, which he's calling here machshava, which is the heskim, agreeable or consideration. Then comes the end of the process, achlata shusof haratzon klali, the achlata, which is the final determination, and that's the beginning of the ratzon prati. After the tchilas starts the beginning of the next level, which would be a specific desire, shemamena ba ratzon hakodim, which would then lead to the ratzon hakodim, which we'll discuss a little later. That precedes, that is like the last level before the implementation begins. And then he says, so that's the third level. Between the being agreeable or considering, which is the first stirring of something in the spirit. Before that, as we said, there's nothing going on consciously. She says between this consideration and the final determination comes a shaka v'tarya, that's a deliberation. So we have consideration, deliberation, determination. I think of the 3 levels he's describing here. That would be a good way to put it. So he says, okay. So he says, now okay, those words I did not really explain because I'm still trying to figure out what it means. He's saying this level of shaka v'tarya is the chemer of the ratzon prati. It means it's the matter from which the next level, the specific desire, which has already shape, is built from. So it could be what he's saying, if I may, is if you just have a consideration, so just a general, I'm considering it. Shaka v'tarya, what's the shaka v'tarya? Shaka v'tarya is back and forth. Is it really something I want? I'm considering, as I said, something is stimulated and inspired. I want to have a home. I'm considering whether I want to have a home. You start weighing it back and forth. this detailed weighing back and forth, what he seems to be saying, becomes the ingredients that once you make the determination, and you've already went through the Shaka V'Tarya, because Shaka V'Tarya weighed all the pros and cons. Should you not? So then once the determination is made, and you now go into the next level of details and spelling out what is it that you want, it could be that being informed by the chaymer of that is built from the Shaka V'Tarya, because the Shaka V'Tarya went through a process of pros and cons that perhaps is feeding the specifics. That's what it sounds like he's saying, but it can't say definitely because he doesn't say enough words. He just says is the chaymer of, going back, the chaymer, where is it? Yeah, chaymer ha'rotzon ha'prativ v'yiseid l'rotzon ha'kodem. And the foundation to the next level, which is going to be the hashara, where you actually envision and allocate resources. So it could be that the genesis of all of that is born in the Shaka V'Tarya when you're weighing it back and forth. Because what are you weighing? You start thinking about it. You're thinking, should there be a house like this? Should it be a house like that? And then you come to the determination, yes, it's worthy. But it's not yet in a pursuit. So there's no really details in the sense that you're envisioning. You're just weighing the whole thing. So it sounds like that the weighing back and forth, the deliberation, has some type of detail, but not details that you can define as being the specifics of what home you want. Just in the general theories of it, you're speculating. So once there's the consideration, you speculate, and that seems to be important for the next stage. That's what he says. I'm not, again, I think what it's a little abstract, but I think what he's saying is that once you went to the Shaka V'Tarya, you have at least substance with what to work with once you've made the determination and you want to move it forward. That's what it seems like.
Are you on page 56? I don't know which page you are.
I said in the beginning, where we left off last time, 81. In Tzadik Dalet.
Thank you. I wasn't here the last time, so you just jump until 81. Okay.
Listen, if any of you miss a class, my suggestion is either you listen to it or you look on the WhatsApp group, and anyone who's not on it should definitely join. And there it says on each class what page it's on, so you can see where we're at.
Thank you.
Okay. This is basic housekeeping. Yeah. Good. So, okay. Now it continues, and we learned this already, but I'm going over it again for obvious reasons. Now he goes, going back. So we've broken down the Ratzon Klali to 3 steps: a consideration, a deliberation, and a conclusion, a determination. But it's all still not actively pursuing, and it's not in the form of a tzinner. That's why it's called machshava, but it's called Ratzon Klali is what he's called it now. Now he says, this consideration, or agreement is also right, but I think consideration just flows easier when explaining it. That precedes the determined result, the final determination. Ratzon Klali, which he said is the beginning of the Ratzon Klali, is the beginning of the process. It's the first stirring, is the Heskem. Shetover Kazer Roy Litzis, that this thing is worthy of desiring. That's the beginning of the process, considering whether it's worthy of desiring. So he says now 2 things about this. This Heskem is removed from the later stages in this sense. I'm reading it inside now. I'm going to read the whole thing because it's worthwhile reading. Not only is it still distant from an actual desire. He doesn't mean bepel here an actual production. He means an actual desire. It's distant from that because it's only a consideration, and you haven't even finished just beginning the deliberation on it. Ala av gamzos. So not only is it distant from an active desire, it's in addition, it's also, moreover, or in addition to, it's not just distant from an active desire, but it's also distant from a achlota, from a determination. Because you still have to go through, because preceding the determination comes the deliberation. The Heskim hasn't begun to deliberate yet. And when you do in this deliberation, it's possible that the result should be opposite of what you considered. You considered the idea, this desire, and then you know what? The Shakavatari led you to a conclusion. It's not something that you want to you're determined to do. So not only is the Heskim distant from the next stage of active desire, it's even distant from a determination. You can't even say, will you end up determining that, yes, this is what I want, or this is worthy of wanting. That's what he says very clearly. Vatama dover, and the reason for this is who? Liya shemeiseris ada Heskim. The reason for this is that goes through a process like this, and it can end up not being the way it began, is because from the stimulation or from the inspiration till the Heskim. So he's added now another level, the inspiration that leads to the consideration. So I got inspiration, consideration, deliberation, and determination. Okay. Yeah. So he says now, from the Yisraelis, Ada Heskim, till the consideration, Uma Heskim Ada Achlota, and from the consideration to the determination, Yochelav is Manrav. A lot of time can pass in between all these levels. Gam Meshech Rabbis Beshanim. It could also extend for numerous years, many years. This apparently means on all levels, because it looks like from the Yisraelis, I guess from the Yisraelis to the consideration, to the determination, all that can span over a period of time and many years. Good. L'chein, therefore, hinei av gam kasher huskem benafshe. So what does that tell us? The fact that it could take so much time. So even gam kasher huskem benafshe, even though when it was agreeable to his nefesh, or his nefesh has agreed to consider, shedavar kazeh roy litzes by, that this thing is worthy of wanting. Hinei baskom azu, the main thing that happened here was not that you came to the determination. The main thing was, it's a very important line here. In this haskama, in this consideration or this agreement, the main primary role of this early stirring of consideration or agreement is that the nefesh should move. The nefesh should move from its complete removed state. Remember, the nefesh is mufshit and mushlal, he says. Mufshit means completely undressed or completely removed from the nefesh before any inspiration is intact in its own place. It has no relationship with another. In Lamaila, that would be Erein Sof Er Atzmi, has no relationship. All it is a reflection of the source. But it's something. What is it something? The only thing that its primary role is that the nefesh has left its complete isolated and removed state. When I gave the example, for instance, with a teacher, he's learning on his own. Doesn't need anyone. He's not waiting for students. He's not expecting. He's not preparing. But with one thing happens to move toward becoming a teacher is the nefesh has to make a move. Some azaza, some movement, some shift. That's a good word. Some shift from complete self-contained state that I'm now going to begin to relate. So the focus, he says here, is not on what it's relating to, is that the nefesh is coming forward. It's almost like when you say, when someone comes to you, I mentioned this the other day, I think it's a good example here. Someone comes to you with an offer. We want to hire you to be a Rosh Yeshiva, a teacher, or whatever. We want to appoint you to be something. You say to the person often, you can say, I'm not interested. I have my life. Everything is going well. The Rebbe, after the Frierdiker Rebbe's Histalkus and Tavshin Yud, no, he had his life. He wanted to remain in his own more anonymous state. learning, davening, doing what he does. He didn't want to become a public figure, didn't want to become the Rebbe. So I'm not going into the Rebbe's nefesh now to figure out what was going on, but there's a point where you're not yet, I'm not even considering it. No, it's not for me. I am comfortable where I am. Comfortable is not the right word. I am where I am, and that's my role. Like the Baal Shem Tov, till he was 36, no one knew who he was. He was a tzaddik nister. He had to be compelled and told, now's the time to go reveal yourself. My point is, there's just an example. Obviously, it's not completely like Etzem HaNefesh, because he was active, the Baal Shem Tov and the Rebbe and so on. My point is, there's a state where you don't want to relate to another. You're not in, and again, I should not, you don't want to. You don't have a need, and there's no interest in the Zulas, as he's calling it. As soon as there's that inspiration, whatever the cause of the inspiration, we're not discussing now, that stimulates and something stirs within you and say, perhaps I'll consider it. Now something has happened. It's actually the most important step, frankly, because if that doesn't happen, the rest is not going to follow. So what happened now is, I'm going to consider Roi Lirzes Boy. This is worthy to want, and I'm going to consider it. It's still not a shakavitaria, no deliberation. It's not determination. It's definitely not the desire that pursues and drawn. So he's saying, what's the ikar role of this heskem? I'll just read it again. The primary so-called contribution, or the primary innovation, or the primary function is that the nefesh is leaving, moving away, so to speak, or shifting from its previous state of complete isolation or aloofness, or being removed from, I'm trying to find the right word. Isolation is not the word I'm looking for. I'm looking for self-containment. The soul on its own was completely removed from any other thing to connect. It was not in any way relating to another to connect to it. Basically a relationship.
What affect the nefesh to make this change?
I just said 4 times, it doesn't really matter here in this discussion. Whatever the reason is, I gave different examples earlier of what could cause a person to start wanting to have a home, let's say.
But that's not a shaklavitaria, right? The shaklavitaria is after.
Is afterwards. This is just consideration, is the word I was using. You're agreeing to consider. It's like I just said, someone comes and offers you a job. In the beginning, you absolutely reject it. Then some point, maybe you think about it again, or maybe something happens, or some need, or something happens that causes you to start considering it. There are many reasons how you can explain it. I'm not talking Lamaila. By the Eibishter, he chose to consider it. There was no outside factor that obviously affected him. But he created this process. So now, he's now in a state where the main primary focus here is not on what you desire, but that the nefesh is shifting to a state of considering a relationship. That's the best way I would phrase it. Ubaskama zu nasa yiridim amuhus nafshe. In this agreement, or in this state of consideration that he's begun to consider it, the mehus nafshe yirida, a descent from the core soul, lischaber ledover zulosa, to connect or to attach or to relate to another, to something
Why
other.
Yerida? Why not Yetzio? Memahus nafshoi. Why Yerida?
I'd rather not go into now. Let me, if you don't mind, I would ask you all to just let me read this and explain it. There's enough here that's complicated that I want to not get distracted. Let me teach it as I see fit. And if you have any question, take a pen and write down the question. We'll go back to Yerida, Yetzia, and so on. I don't want to now be medayik in the lashenis. I want to keep focused because this is very intricate. So if you don't mind, and as I said, write it down. I'll go back to it. I'm not saying it's not a good question. I just want to stick to the flow of ideas here. Okay. Ubaskoma zu nasi yeride memuhus nafshe lischaber ledova zulosa. To connect with, basically, as I said, to have a relationship with another outside of itself. V'hainu, this means shebahaskama zu hanefesh yitzas miklal hafshota v'shlila. This means that with this agreement or this consideration, nefesh has now left from its state of hafshota and shlila, from being removed and negating anything outside of itself. Uba leklal nesinas mokim, and it's now come to nesinas mokim. It's giving room. It's considering. Till now, it didn't consider anything. It had no need to consider. Now it's giving room nesinas mokim. Lahatoya v'amshacha l'davar zulasa, to be inclined to or drawn to another, to something other than itself. That's what the haskama does. The main thing is the shift of the soul from a state of complete, beyond it all, beyond relationship, to the consideration and the leaving room that it's possible that there will be a relationship. But no, there was no deliberation yet, and there was definitely no determination, and definitely not the next level. That's what we have here. So 3 levels, yeah, good. Okay. Hare. So this we learned, but it's good reading it again. Hare. So what did we deduce from this? The Inyan has the haskama, misyaches yeser, that haskama, this first level, this first stirring of considering this a relationship, misyaches yeser, relates more el maim the matzav hanefesh. It relates more to the state of the soul, the state of being of the soul, more than it relates to the object, to the thing that arose in this consideration, meaning the relationship with the other, whatever it may be, whether it's a home, whether it's a student, whether it's art, whatever the desire is going to lead to. So in other words, at this stage, something has happened, but it's still focused on the source, not on the product. So basically, the Heskim is serving the role of beginning the process of considering and of leaving room for the possibility of a relationship, but the focus is on the matzav that the nefesh has made a shift. That's all that matters at this stage. That's the primary thing, I should say. Iker. You may be wondering why it's so important to make this point, but in the Nimshal, when you talk Lamaila, it's very important because you want to say that in the highest levels, there's still the beginning, even when it begins to consider a relationship, it's still reflective of atzmus, atzmi. It's real reflective of the source. Because remember, in the interface, you want the source's involvement in an undiluted way. The more it becomes a ratzon, a desire that relates to existence, remember, it starts diminishing. The erg begins to go through gradations. The more it relates to existence, in a way, the more distant it becomes from the source. So that's why the more levels he can find that relate to the source and at the same time are beginning the stirrings to relate to another, the deeper the interface becomes. So this is why this is so important, these dissecting this. It's not just some semantics. Okay. Zeisa meres, this means, or in other words, asher beheskem zeh, with this agreement or with this consideration, which was the first stirring, nischadesh chidush dover ba nefesh. Something new was innovated or was something new was introduced in the nefesh. Okay. What new was introduced? The consideration of a relationship with another. That's what was introduced. On the other hand, he's going now back to explaining why it's not a Metzias Dover Ma. Remember, he said at the beginning, at the bottom of last page, that as much as it's a Yerida and a Yetzia, as much as it's now a move, a shift away from the complete self-contained state of the core soul to the consideration of some relationship, Aval, it's a chiddush in the consideration of the soul that is considering, but nothing was actually created. It's the soul considering a relationship. So nothing new was created here. Nothing new was innovated as an object. It's in a state of mind something shifted. That the soul on its own is completely removed, and now it's considering a relationship. But nothing happened in actuality. Not only, he's explaining now why nothing happened. Not only is there's still not a mehus mitziyuse klal, which is the next stage. Mehus mitziyuse would mean the muhus of the mitzvahs of the ratzon that's already being drawn and pursuing whatever the object is. So besides that we're not there, that would be an action. The ratzon is actively pursuing something. I wouldn't say call it an action. It's an active ratzon that's serving as a channel and pursuing its object. So not only is this stage where we are now in the Heskim, not only is it not that, like he said before, he said also the leizu bulvad. But more than that, even the mitzias of the muhus you don't yet have. That would be the hachlota. That would be the determination. Here it's only a consideration. Okay. As I explained the other class, that there's muhus, mitzias ha-muhus, muhus ha-mitzias, and mitzias ha-mitzias. In this case, the second level of ratzon is the mitzias of the ratzon, because it's actively pursuing. In that, there's the muhus of the ratzon, its role, that what is that? That it's not just the bechein, that ratzon wanting something, actively, not just the result of the pursuit, but the active pursuit, that he called muhus ha-mitzias. When you talk about Heskim, he's saying now, even though at the bottom of last page, he said a little differently, but I guess when you break it down, he said this Heskim, which was the beginning of the stimulation, of the stirring, of consideration. Not only is it not a mitzias dover, meaning that it's an active desire pursuing the object, but even in this level of muhus, it's not even mitzias ha-muhus because it's not determined. It could also end up not happening, as he said before. It's only a consideration. That's what he said here. Yeah. Because after this agreement or after this consideration, still comes the liberation. Okay, now continue. One second. Okay. Well, he's going now further and now analyzing this deliberation. Where is that happening? He says it's in the muchus of the mitzias of the ratzon itself. Okay, I have to get back to that, what that means, which level. But bottom line, he's definitely saying it's the muchus of, because the mitzias of the ratzon is that you active, that you have a ratzon, you have a desire, determination. Muhus ha-mitzias is what defines that what defines that ratzon. What defines it is muhus, mahu. What is the identity? So the shakavitaria is the whole process, how you got to that desire. So he's calling it part of muhus mitzias of ratzon itself. The eina shakavitaria b'seichel, the seichel. If you remember, we learned this earlier, This is not the deliberation that comes from seichel. If you recall on page, what page was that? We talked about chokhmah bina. That bina is the main place of desire bottom of 53 and 54. So that was a deliberation. That was a logical deliberation, where a person with their seichel deliberates and determines the truth of any particular idea. Here we're talking about the deliberation in desire itself, meaning it's not based on logic necessarily. So we discussed then, what is it based on? What's the deliberation? What determines? So I think I said then, I'm not positive. I think when we learned that, I'm looking a moment. It could be that it's based on intuition or based on just the desire, determining whether your nefesh actually wants this, not necessarily a seichel deliberation. I would need to think about more how to explain that, but it could be something like, is this something I really want? Like, let's say someone says a home. So it could be a deliberation that's not necessarily based whether you have the money or whether there's other logical factors involved. It could be you just determining, is this something I really want, and am I ready to go pursue it at some point? So it could be that's what he means here. But the point being, as I said, I don't have more explanation right now, but that's what I would say for now. She says, so even though the shakha v'tayri is a muchus of rotzen mamish, of rotzen atzmei, I'm sorry, the ein shakha v'tayri de seichel. It's not the deliberation that happens on a logical, rational level. The bezeh cholok guf mitzias harotzen meseichel. Because in this is a distinction, this is what distinguishes, in this is what distinguishes guf mitzias harotzen meseichel, the actual body of the desire and intelligence. Da seichel yesh leitam. Intelligence has a reason. There's rational reason. Asher matam nasa taina shu hechrich sichli. Okay, it looks like he's explaining now the difference. That's because of the reason. So then you have an argument, which is a hu hechrich sichli, which is a hechrich sichli, a logical proof, a logical not proof, a logical compelling argument. The ba haba b'shnei tenuas sichlim, that manifests in two intellectual cognitive movements. Vehem tenuas achiv v'tenuas ashlila. Tenuas achiv means a movement toward a positive movement, and tenuas ashlila is negating. Let me explain this. When a person deliberates on an intellectual level, meaning on the mind, if something is something that you are looking at an idea, let's say, like we learned earlier, someone presents to you a theory. Now you sit down and start deliberating, is this theory accurate or not? Is it true? So you go back and forth, you look at different evidence, you do research. I just want to see the language he used there. He actually said two things. You determine, is this a kruma, is this a theory that's worth exploring, or is it a kruma svara, like he said? Maybe it's not. After some deliberation, you come to determine, you come back and say this is nonsense, or this is not, no, it doesn't resonate, or something like that. He said the second form of the deliberation in intelligence is where someone takes a theory to explain a certain phenomenon. So in other words, let's say the Mishnah says a statement, come to Amarayim, and they start debating what is the reason for this statement made by the Tan and the Mishnah. And here's where the Shakha V'Tadi is to determine whether their arguments are consistent So the first element of deliberation is to determine the truth of the idea. The second one is determine the truth of the explanation and the theory behind that is explaining the idea. That's what he said back there. So he says, now he adds that the deliberation and intelligence is in two movements. Is this something that is worth, that is chiyuv? No, I correct myself. It doesn't mean right or wrong. Tenus achiyuv and tenus ashlila probably means here, is it something you can understand directly or something you have to extrapolate, understand through yediyas hashlila? That's probably what he means here. I'm not positive. Because earlier, if you remember, he said there are things that you can determine they're good for you, or things that you negate, they're not good for you. So it could be he means that, but it doesn't sound like it. Because he says the seichel is coming in two movements. Seichel in two movements, one is chiyuv, meaning understanding, and one is shlila, negating something. It's basically the intellectual process of any idea, where you reject certain process of elimination, that's shlila, and chiyuv is where you relate to it or you understand it. That's most likely what he means. That's in Shakavitaria in intellectual deliberation. Aval mitzias mohusei shel harotzen. Now we say mitzias mohusei. Okay, but the mitzias of the mohus of the rotzen, which means he's talking now the higher levels of the rotzen, when it's still in its earlier stages. Who? Shekashem she'ein leitam. Shekashem she'ein leitam. Kach ein leitaina hechrachis. When you're dealing with desire is not based on logic. So that's what he wants, but just like it has no reason, it also doesn't have any compelling argument. Anything that compels to say one way or another. The zeu mitzius mechusei mashur reitza. This is the mitzius mechusei of that he desires, mashur reitza. That's its mitzius. That's what he wants. The zeh atzmei b'mechus mitzius shu atoyev amshachal le'esei adover shur reitza. And that itself then moves into the next state, the muhus of the mitzias, that there's the inclination and the being drawn to that thing that he desires. Boy, ukanal the b'chol dover. Okay, one sec. Okay, let me pause a minute. There's a lot of things happening here. I just want to break it down because it's getting very confusing. Okay, the first thing we established is that the heskim, the consideration, its primary role is this shift of the soul, the state of the soul, from complete self-containment and removed from anything else to considering and leaving room for the possibility of a relationship. So he says you can't call that, it's a chidush in, you can say like in the gavra, in the person, the state of mind has shifted, or the state of desire, or the state of the soul has shifted, I should say. But you can't say that something actually new was innovated because nothing has happened. The Shakavitaria, the deliberation hasn't even begun. So besides the fact that it's removed from an actual desire, level 2, which is the pursuit, it's even removed from an actual determination because it's just the beginning of a consideration. That was the first thing he made clear. Now he's discussing the liberation itself. And he's saying a bunch of things. I'm trying to just organize it. One is he said that the deliberation is not like seichel. That's right. Now let's address that before we address more things. Because he said many things about this deliberation. This deliberation is not based on logical reasoning. Seichel's deliberation is logical reasoning. Things have reasons, an argument this way, an argument that way. When it comes to Ratzon, he says it's what you desire and that's that. It doesn't have to have a reason. He didn't say that you cannot that a Ratzon can't come with a reason. There are many things we want that do have a reason. But let's say the Ratzon Atzmi, to love a child, the Ratzon Atzmi to want a home. Yes, you can explain it. You can explain why you love your child because it's part of your biological flesh and blood. But that's not the reason for the desire. That's just explaining why it's there. The reason is because that's who you are. You're wired that way. Why do we want a home? So of course you can explain. You want a home. We don't need a shelter, protect us from the elements, from wild animals, from criminals. But that's not where it's rooted. It's not rooted on a logical discussion here. It's inherent in the soul is that a human being needs a home. Something completes us when we don't live in the street and we live in a dwelling that we can call our own. Something comfortable about it, something nurturing about it. It's like love. Someone say, why do you need love? Of course, there's reasons. Love brings companionship, brings intimacy. Love brings caring. It can bring out the best in you. But is that the reason why you love? No, because we're wired that way. We are fundamentally that way. We desire love because it's part of who we are. A human being is not complete without love. So when you say al pi seichel would be, it's optional. Someone comes to you and says, I want to sell you a car. There's no Ratzon Atzmi for a car. It's a means to an end. You'll say, you know what, it's going to make my life more convenient. So there's a good logic for it, so I'll buy it. So there, tam v'das seichel is very important because you're deliberating on something that needs good reasoning. Why would I do it if I didn't have a reason? Or if, in more abstract thinking, you're trying to understand something. Like I said, a Mishnah, Gemara. So there, absolutely, you need seichel. Ratzon is not enough. You could say, I want to learn Torah, but Torah requires using your mind and going back and forth, understanding this, understanding that, rejecting certain theories, accepting others. Chiyuv shlila, like he said here, however we explain that. When it comes to Ratzon, he says, Ratzon is not defined by logic. Ratzon is defined by how you're wired. The nefesh is wired a certain way. Yes, for many years, certain things can remain dormant. Now that something's being stimulated, a consideration, and now you're going through a deliberation. Deliberation is not a logical one. It's more on a Ratzon level. Maybe the word resonating may work here a little, even though I used it in seichel, but what resonates? Does this Ratzon resonate with you? So that's the consideration. Again, he doesn't say specifically what is the deliberation, like what are you deliberating? But he does say specifically, explicitly, that deliberation is not due to a tam, and therefore it doesn't have a taina achrachis. You don't have any compelling reason, compelling argument, I should say. Then there's another point we want to talk about is what is muhus ha-metzias and metzias ha-muhus. As you see, I'm leaving that for last because that, I think, complicates matters. So I want to just first talk about the etzem inyan that he's discussing here, what he wants to get across. Then we need to analyze what's this whole metzias ha-muhus, muhus ha-metzias, which, if you don't mind, even though we did read it, I'm just going to take a little different approach here that I usually do. I'm not going to analyze those words because I see there's a lot going on here. And I think just to keep order, let's just talk about the things that are clear. Then we're going to go back and say, okay, so where does each level reside? What's the metzias of Ratzon? What's the muhus of Ratzon? But I see to do that, we're going to need to read further because he's now going to go back to metzias and muhus. Now, this is not uncommon in Chassidus because you'd think that he would say that earlier. But very often, the Maimer things start developing and suddenly there's almost, I don't want to say run on, but ideas overlap and new ideas come in place. So I'm just trying as a good teacher, as best as I can at least, to try to structure it. So to talk about the themes in an organized way, then we'll go back and see how it's read. I'm just seeing that's the way to do it. If you don't do it that way, there's going to be too many, not tangential, but too many side different things that need to be explained. Like this whole Mehus Metzias, Mahus, as soon as I read it, right away I'm saying, 1 second, which is which? What's going on? But I would just rather not go there. So I know you want me to go there right now. I'd rather not because I'd rather first get the general theme. Then we'll go back and figure out what is what. What's a Metzias, what's a Mahus, okay? So I hope I'm trying to explain my approach here. Okay. So we determine now, what?
Makes sense.
Yeah, no, we'll go back. We're not running away from it. I'm just reading it. I see that I got to first figure out So right now we're in the middle of a discussion. What is Shaka V'Tarya? He didn't ask a question, but it's a question. Hagam that the Shaka V'Tarya is in Rotzen Atzmei. I'm not sure where he's going with this, because he already made the case that the consideration is definitely not a Mitzias Dover. It's definitely not, nothing was in Schad. There's nothing new in the Chefze, so to speak. It's only in a shift in the mindset or the state of the soul to consider another. But now he's discussing the deliberation. So, being it's already 10:30, I'm going to stop here because I see it's a back and forth, and it's going to not be a minute. So we'll resume this on Sunday. And as those of us that have been on this journey now for 8 years or whatever amount of years since you joined Ayin Beis know, some places you get, it comes it's like very thick forest. You have to make it through. You have to go very slowly, but we'll get through it. So rest assured, even though right now it's not completely clear, and I'm acknowledging that, but we're learning it for the first time. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, this is all Frierdiker Rebbe, by the way. This is not the Rebbe, this is explaining the Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe style. But you have to remember, this is the deepest hemshech of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So don't be surprised that's not that easy to fully grasp, but it's the first time. So it's perfectly normal. So don't feel that in any way discouraged. That's my point. So we're going to continue. We'll stop here at the middle of page 81. If someone has a question about what we're talking, because if you have a question, Mahus Mitzias, I'm not going to address that now because I still have to figure it out. If around this thing, if you want to ask something, by all means. I silenced everybody.
No, you didn't. You made it clear that we are all confused, but you started.
You know what? It's a good step because being confused is the first step toward clarity.
Yeah.
We'll get there. I think it's very fascinating. You obviously can read it, and I'm going to try to explain it. So we'll continue Sunday at 10, right?